The storm over Seoul didn't just bring rain, it brought a reckoning. At 2:14 a.m., the motion sensors in Kang Ji-hoon's penthouse didn't trigger for a hitman or a high-level associate. They triggered for a small, shivering figure standing in the shadows of the service elevator. Amira Joy Bennett didn't look like a threat, but as she raised a small, trembling fist to knock on the steel door, she was about to do more damage to Ji-hoon's empire than any rival syndicate. She stood there in a soaked, mustard yellow velvet coat that cost more than a janitor's yearly salary, her eyes wide and reflecting the cold neon of the city below. When the door finally swung open, revealing the man the underworld called the Winter King, she didn't flinch. Ji-hoon stood framed in the sterile, white light of his foyer, a blackened HK VP9 pistol held low against his thigh. He expected a professional, a message, or a bullet. Instead, he found a child who barely reached his waist. "You're not supposed to be here," Ji-hoon said, his voice a low, dangerous rasp that usually sent grown men to their knees. Amira didn't cry. Her teeth chattered, the sound rhythmic and fragile against the hum of the building's climate control. Without a word, she reached into her pocket and pulled out an object wrapped in a silk handkerchief. She held it out with both hands, her knuckles ash dark against the damp fabric. Ji-hoon's breath hitched, a sensation he hadn't felt in a decade. As the silk fell away, it revealed a gold-embossed fountain pen. It was a heavy, archaic thing, out of place in his world of digital encryption in polymer steel. He recognized the scratch on the cap immediately. It was the pen he had handed to a terrified woman named Keisha in a basement 10 years ago, telling her to sign the papers that would set her free and never to look back. "My mom said you're the man who pays his debts," Amira whispered, her voice small but steady. "She said if the men in the black masks ever came, I should find the ghosts and show him this." The weight of the pen felt like a mountain in Ji-hoon's palm. He looked past the girl into the empty, rain-lashed hallway, his tactical brain already calculating the breach. If she was here, the sanctuary he had bought for Keisha was gone. The men in masks were his own shadow, catching up to him. "Where is she, Amira?" he asked, the coldness in his heart beginning to fracture. "She took her," she said, a single tear finally escaping and tracing a path through the rainwater on her cheek. "But I hid, just like she told me." Ji-hoon stepped back, gesturing her into the fortress of glass and steel. He didn't know how to talk to a child, but he knew how to wage a war. As the heavy door hissed shut and the deadbolt engaged with a series of metallic thuds, the debt was no longer a memory. It was alive, shivering in a yellow coat in the center of his room. The night she knocked on his door changed everything. The Winter King was gone, and a protector was born. The heavy silence of the penthouse, usually a source of cold comfort for Ji-hoon, now felt suffocatingly loud. He stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, watching the rain lash against the glass, while behind him the infection began. It wasn't a virus. It was the soft, rhythmic squelch of wet sneakers on Italian marble and the rustle of a damp velvet coat. Ji-hoon turned to see Amira sitting on the edge of his pristine, white leather sofa. She looked like a smudge of charcoal on a fresh canvas. He realized with a jolt of irritation that he had no idea how to exist in the same space as something so fragile. His home was a machine for living, sharp edges, glass surfaces, and a refrigerator stocked only with alkaline water and high-end scotch. "Take off the coat," he commanded, his voice perhaps a shade too sharp. Amira flinched, and for the first time, Ji-hoon felt a prickle of something like shame. He softened his tone, clearing his throat. "It's wet, you'll get sick." He watched as she struggled with the buttons, her small fingers numb from the cold. Instinctively, he moved to help, but stopped a foot away. He hadn't touched another human being without the intent to harm or control in years. Slowly, he knelt, a posture he usually reserved for checking for tripwires, and reached out. His large, calloused hands, scarred from a decade of fixing the city's darkest problems, looked monstrous against the yellow velvet. He undid the buttons with clinical precision, his eyes avoiding hers. When the coat fell away, he saw she was wearing a Sunday dress, now stained and sagging. He disappeared into his bedroom and returned with a gray cashmere sweater, the smallest thing he owned. "Put this on," he said. It swallowed her whole, the sleeves dangling past her knees, but the shivering stopped. He went to the kitchen, his mind racing through tactical extractions and satellite pings, yet his hands were busy doing something entirely foreign, heating milk. He didn't have cocoa, but he found a jar of organic honey a client had gifted him months ago. As he stirred the mixture, the scent of sweetness began to overwrite the sterile smell of gun oil and expensive cologne that usually defined his air. He set the mug on the coffee table. Amira looked at it, then up at him. "Are you a bad man?" she asked suddenly. "My mom said you did bad things, but you had a good heart, like a knight in a dusty suit." Ji-hoon felt a phantom pain in his chest, right where his conscience used to be. "There are no knights in this city, Amira. Only people who owe and people who collect." He sat in the armchair opposite her, his eyes drifting to the gold fountain pen on the table between them. He wanted to remain detached. He needed to be the ghost to find Keisha. But as Amira took a sip of the milk and let out a small, contented sigh, the walls of his fortress felt less like protection and more like a cage. The child wasn't just a guest. She was a mirror, reflecting a version of himself he had tried to kill a long time ago. The sweetness of the honey milk still lingered in the air, a foreign invader in a room built for shadows. Ji-hoon didn't wait for the sun. He retreated to his glass-walled office, leaving Amira curled into the oversized cashmere, her eyes finally heavy with the exhaustion of the hunted. Behind the soundproof door, the Winter King returned. He sat before a wall of monitors, his fingers flying across a customized keyboard. He didn't call the police, and he didn't call his legal team. He accessed the Ghost Network, a subterranean web of encrypted servers and paid informants that kept his pulse on the city's jugular. "Trace the Bennett file," he muttered into a secure headset. "Sector 4. I want every traffic cam, every doorbell feed, and every cell ping within 6 blocks of the girl's apartment from midnight to 2 a.m. A gravelly voice crackled in Ji-hoon's ear. "Ji-hoon, that's high-risk data. That sector is currently under internal management by your second, Min-ho. If I dig there, he'll see the ripples." Ji-hoon's jaw tightened. Min-ho, his protege, the man he had groomed to handle the administrative violence of the syndicate so that Ji-hoon could move toward the exit. "Dig anyway. If Min-ho asks, tell him the ghost is checking his homework." The screens flickered, bleeding green and white code before settling on a grainy, high-angle shot of a street corner. Ji-hoon watched the playback. A black SUV, unmarked, but with a specific reinforced chassis used by his own security detail, pulled up to Keisha's building. 2 men exited. They didn't break the door. They had a key. They moved with the synchronized efficiency of the men Ji-hoon had trained himself. 5 minutes later, they emerged. Keisha was between them, her head covered, her struggle evident even in the low resolution. But it was the third man who stepped out last that made Ji-hoon's blood turn to ice. He was adjusting his cufflinks, a habit born of vanity. Min-ho. This wasn't a rival syndicate. This wasn't a random snatching ground. It was a coup. Min-ho wasn't just taking Keisha. He was testing the leash. By kidnapping the one person Ji-hoon had ever shown mercy to, Min-ho was forcing the ghost to choose, stay in the shadows and let her die, or come out to save her and prove he was weak enough to be replaced. Ji-hoon looked past the girl into the empty, rain-lashed hallway, his tactical brain already calculating the breach. If she was here, the sanctuary he had bought for Keisha was gone. The men in masks were his own shadow, catching up to him. "Status on the SUV," Ji-hoon commanded, his voice cold enough to crack stone. "Heading toward the old industrial pier, but there's a problem. Min-ho just sent out a broadcast to the entire detail. He's declared you compromised. They aren't just holding the woman anymore. They're coming to the penthouse to sanitize the witness." Ji-hoon stood up, his hand resting on the gold fountain pen in his pocket. He didn't have time for a war room. He had 10 minutes before his own fortress became his tomb. The calm of the penthouse shattered, not with a bang, but with a sudden, eerie stillness. The power died, plunging the glass palace into a graveyard of shadows and neon reflections. In the sudden dark, the electronic locks on the service door emitted a final, pathetic click. Ji-hoon was across the room before the sound finished. He scooped Amira from the sofa, his arm a band of iron around her waist, as he pressed her back into the deep recess of the kitchen's marble island. "Stay down," he hissed. "Do not move, do not make a sound." "Ji-hoon," she whispered, the name a fragile plea. "I've got you," he replied, and for the first time he realized he wasn't lying to comfort her. He was making a vow. The front doors didn't just open, they disintegrated. A breaching charge sent shards of reinforced timber and metal singing through the air like shrapnel. "No!" Ji-hoon's voice was a roar. He didn't seek cover. He stepped directly into the line of fire, his own weapon barking twice. The intruder slumped, but a stray round from the man's dying reflex skipped off the marble, inches from where Amira lay. Silence returned, heavy and smelling of cordite. Ji-hoon rushed to the island, his hands shaking as he pulled Amira into his chest. He checked her for blood, his eyes frantic. She was unhurt, but her eyes were fixed on the men on the floor, the men in masks who would come for her mother. "We have to go," Ji-hoon said, his voice ragged. He realized then that he couldn't stay here and defend a fortress. Min-ho would keep sending men until the penthouse was a sieve. He had to take the child and disappear into the only place the syndicate couldn't see, the cracks in the city floor. The rain was a suffocating curtain as Ji-hoon navigated the service stairs, his lungs burning. He had tucked Amira into the back of a nondescript, armored sedan he kept in the basement sublevel, a vehicle scrubbed of all digital tracking, a ghost car for a ghost's exit. He drove in silence, his eyes darting to the rear-view mirror every 3 seconds. They were heading toward the industrial docks, but his mind was stuck on the pier. Min-ho was a creature of logic. He wouldn't just take Keisha to kill her. He was waiting for Ji-hoon to show up at a prearranged kill zone. "They had a song," Amira whispered from the shadows of the back seat. Ji-hoon gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles went white. "What, Amira? The men?" "No," she said, leaning forward until her small face was visible in the glow of the dashboard. "The men were quiet, but the radio in the truck, it wasn't a song, it was a lady's voice. She was saying numbers, then a poem about a blue bell. Mom got really still when she heard it. She looked at the clock, and then she looked at me and said, 'The blue bell rings at the bottom of the sea.'" Ji-hoon slammed on the brakes, the tires shrieking against the wet asphalt. He pulled into a dark alleyway, the engine idling with a low, predatory hum. A blue bell at the bottom of the sea. To a child, it was a nursery rhyme. To an elite fixer like Ji-hoon, it was a specific, outdated naval code used by the old guard of the Busan shipyards, a code for a decommissioned submarine tender called the Bluebell. It wasn't at the industrial pier. It was anchored 4 miles south, in the dead zone where the old scrapyards met the deep water. "Amira?" Ji-hoon said, turning to look at her, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity. "Did she say anything else? Anything about a number?" "She said, 44 minutes past the hour, the bell rings for the king." Ji-hoon looked at the clock's clock, 3:18 a.m. If the bell rang at 3:44, he had 26 minutes. Min-ho wasn't just holding a ransom, he was setting a timed execution. He had leaked the industrial pier location to Ji-hoon's informants as a decoy to waste his time, knowing the ghost would spend his last hour clearing the wrong building while the bluebell slipped beneath the waves or burned in the harbor. Min-ho had underestimated the child. He had assumed Amira was a liability, a piece of luggage to be discarded. He hadn't realized that Keisha Bennett had trained her daughter to be the eyes and ears of a survivor. "You're a genius, Amira," Ji-hoon said, his voice thick with a new kind of respect. He shifted the car into gear, the engine roaring as he pulled a hard U-turn. He wasn't going to the pier, he was going to the scrapyards, and he wasn't going as a negotiator, he was going as a wrecking ball. The scrapyards of the Southern District were a graveyard of rusted iron and forgotten promises, a place where the city's glitter died in a heap of salt-crusted metal. Ji-hoon killed the lights blocks away, rolling the armored Sagan into the shadow of a collapsed crane. This was the Gray, the invisible layer of the city where the law didn't reach and the syndicate didn't care to look. He led Amira through a maze of shipping containers to a small, windowless structure that looked like an abandoned foreman's office. He knocked a rhythmic, heavy sequence against the reinforced door. A small slit opened, a pair of suspicious eyes peered out, and then the heavy bolts slid back. Ji-hoon? The voice belonged to Gwan, an old man with a face like crumpled parchment and hands stained permanently with grease. Gwan had been the syndicate's master armorer until he'd grown a conscience and Ji-hoon had erased his death warrant. "You look like you've crawled out of a grave." "I might be heading into one," Ji-hoon replied, ushering Amira inside. "This is Amira. She's the daughter of a friend. I need her hidden. No one knows this place exists except me." The room was filled with the smell of oil and old paper. Gwan looked at the girl, then at the gray cashmere sweater that swallowed her, and finally at the cold, lethal intent in Ji-hoon's eyes. He didn't ask questions. He simply moved a pile of blueprints from a small cot in the corner. "Sit, child," Gwan said softly. "I have tea, and I have a dog who sleeps under the table. You'll be safe here." Ji-hoon knelt in front of Amira one last time. He checked his watch. 3:31 a.m. 13 minutes until the bell rang on the bluebell. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold fountain pen, pressing it into her small hand. "Hold on to this for me," he said. "If I'm not back by sunrise, Gwan will take you to a place where the men in masks can never find you." "You're going to get my mom," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of faith. "You are," Ji-hoon promised. He stood up, his face hardening into a mask of stone. He turned to Gwan, his voice dropping into a whisper. "If Min-ho's men come here, burn everything. Don't let them take her." Gwan nodded, reaching under the workbench to pull out a heavy, modified shotgun. "They'll have to go through the iron first, boss." Ji-hoon stepped back into the rain, the door hissing shut behind him. For the first time in his life, he wasn't fighting for a ledger, a territory, or a title. He was fighting to ensure that the girl holding his pen never had to learn that the world was a place where heroes didn't return. He climbed into the car, checked the action on his pistol, and headed for the deep water. The bluebell sat like a rusted tomb in the oily blackness of the harbor. Ji-hoon approached from the water, cutting the engine of a stolen skiff and drifting into the shadow of the massive tender. Above, the deck was swarming with light and the silhouette of men who used to call him Sir. He scaled the rusted hull with the silence of a wraith, reaching the main deck at 3:41 a.m. 3 minutes. He moved through the bowels of the ship, neutralized 2 guards with a blade to avoid the sound of gunfire, and finally reached the holding bay. The heavy iron door groaned open. Inside, Keisha was bound to a bolted chair, a digital timer wired to a set of incendiary charges beneath the deck plates. Standing over her was Min-ho, his suit still perfect, his expression of bored disappointment. "You're late, Ji-hoon," Min-ho said, checking his watch. "Or perhaps you're just early for the funeral. I expected you to be halfway through a tactical sweep of the pier by now." Ji-hoon stepped into the light, his hands empty and raised, though his eyes remained lethal. "The pier was a predictable play, Min-ho. You forgot that I'm the one who taught you how to lie." Min-ho sneered, stepping closer to Keisha and resting his hand on the detonator. "It doesn't matter. You're alone. You've traded your empire for a woman who was supposed to be a footnote in a file. Look at you, the great Winter King, standing in the dark, begging for a life that means nothing to the syndicate." "It means everything to me," Ji-hoon said steadily. "Let her go. You want the seat? It's yours. I've already sent the digital keys to the offshore accounts to your private server. The transfer completes when I input the final bypass code." Min-ho's eyes flashed with greed. Power was his goal, but the money was the insurance. "The code. Give it to me, and maybe I'll let you both jump before the bell rings." "No," Ji-hoon countered, stepping forward until he could see the sweat on Minho's brow. You released the lock on the timer first. We both know you can't bypass my encryption without me alive. If this ship blows, you're just another lieutenant who lost the boss and the bank on the same night. Is that the legacy you want? The silence in the bay was deafening, broken only by the frantic ticking of the timer. 3:43 a.m. Minho looked at the screen, then at the man he had spent a decade trying to emulate. He saw a weakness in Ji-hoon's mercy, but he also saw the terrifying resolve of a man who had nothing left to lose. Minho reached down and punched a sequence into the timer, the red numbers freezing at 12 seconds. The exchange is simple, old man. You give me the world, and I give you the ghost. The digital display froze at 0012, but the atmosphere remained explosive. Minho reached out, his hand open, waiting for the phone that held the bypass codes to the ghost's fortune. The world for the ghost, Minho stated, a predatory grin stretching across his face. Now. Ji-hoon didn't reach for his phone. He reached for the HK-VP9 tucked in the small of his back. In a blur of motion, he didn't aim for Minho. He fired a single silenced round into the overhead valve of the ship's steam line. A pressurized roar of scalding white vapor hissed into the bay, blinding the guards and masking the sound of Ji-hoon's approach. Minho screamed, firing blindly into the fog, but Ji-hoon was already a shadow in motion. He didn't fight with the cold detachment of a boss. He fought with a terrifying, protective rage. He disarmed the first guard with a wrist-breaking snap, using the body as a shield against the second. "Kill them! Kill them both!" Minho shrieked, scrambling toward the timer to restart the countdown. Ji-hoon vaulted over a stack of rusted crates, his boots hitting the deck with a heavy thud. He caught Minho's arm just as his fingers brushed the keypad. With a guttural snarl, Ji-hoon slammed his former protege's head into the iron bulkhead. The sound was sickeningly final. Minho slumped to the floor, his perfect suit finally ruined, his greed silenced by the cold reality of the man he had tried to replace. The fog began to thin. Ji-hoon spun, his weapon barking twice to neutralize the remaining guards, who were still coughing from the steam. He didn't wait to check their pulses. He rushed to Kesha, his fingers trembling as he worked the heavy serrated blade of his tactical knife through the thick zip ties. "Ji-hoon," she gasped, her voice raw from fear and smoke. "Amira? Is she—" "Safe," he said, pulling her to her feet. "She's the one who found you, Kesha. She's the one who saved us." He looked at the timer. The 12 seconds were still frozen, but the ship's internal alarms were beginning to wail. Minho's men on the upper deck would be coming down any second. Ji-hoon grabbed a radio from a fallen guard. "This is the ghost," he said into the channel, his voice a low, terrifying growl that resonated through the ship's speakers. "Minho is dead. The accounts are locked. If you want to get paid, you'll drop your weapons and clear the deck. If you want to follow a dead man into the harbor, stay in my way." There was a long, agonizing silence. Then the sound of retreating footsteps echoed from the steel rafters. Even in rebellion, they knew you didn't bet against the Winter King when he was protecting his own. Ji-hoon led Kesha out of the bows of the Bluebell and into the cold, gray light of the approaching dawn. The rain had finally slowed to a drizzle. Across the water, the scrapyard loomed, the place where a little girl was waiting with a gold pen and a heart full of hope. The sun didn't so much rise as the sky simply turned a bruised, weary gray. Ji-hoon stood on the pier as the skiff bumped against the rotted wound of the scrapyard. He helped Kesha out, her steps unsteady, but her eyes fixed on the small foreman's office. Before they reached the door, it flew open. Amira didn't hesitate. She sprinted across the gravel, a streak of oversized gray cashmere and flying curls, throwing herself into her mother. The sound that left Kesha, A sob of pure, jagged relief was something Ji-hoon had never heard in his sterile, silent world. He stood back, a shadow among the rusted cranes, watching the debt settle itself in the quiet of the morning. Gwan stepped out of the office, lowering his shotgun and nodding at Ji-hoon. "The world is still turning, I see." "It's a different world now, Gwan," Ji-hoon replied. He walked over to the mother and daughter. Amira looked up, her face tear-stained but glowing. She reached into the pocket of the massive gray cashmere and held out the gold pen. "You came back, just like you promised." Ji-hoon looked at the pen, then at the small hand holding it. He didn't take it. He gently closed her fingers back around the gold barrel. "Keep it, Amira. Consider it a contract. If you ever need the ghost again, you just hold on to that." A week later, the Winter King was officially declared dead in a tragic harbor explosion that had claimed the lives of several high-ranking syndicate members, including the ambitious Min Ho. The offshore accounts were emptied, moved through 10,000 digital filters until they vanished. In a quiet, working-class block of the Southern District, a new landlord took over the local apartments. He was a man of few words, impeccably dressed, but always seen doing his own repairs. He didn't live in a penthouse of glass and steel. He lived in a modest ground-floor unit where he could see the sidewalk. He sat on the bench outside as the neighborhood children played, his eyes never straying far from a girl in a yellow raincoat walking home from school with her mother. He was no longer the ghost of Seoul, and he was no longer a king. He was a neighbor, a shadow, and a silent guardian. Ji-hoon watched Amira wave at him, a bright, secret smile on her face. He didn't smile back, that wasn't his way, but he felt the cold in his chest finally, irrevocably melt. The debt wasn't just paid, it was replaced by a life he finally wanted to live.